I stayed quiet for a long time about what happened. Not because I was ashamed, because I was watching. That's what people don't understand about me. I'm not the type to react. I'm the type to wait until I understand the full picture, and then only then do I move. My name is Zara. I was 26 when I started at Pinnacle Distribution, a mid-sized logistics company based in Auckland. Not glamorous work. We moved freight, mostly dry goods, some chilled across the North Island, with a growing South Island operation that was, honestly, a bit of a mess when I arrived. That mess was exactly why they hired me. I was brought in as an analyst, tasked with cleaning up the southern accounts and finding out why margins kept shrinking on routes that should have been profitable. I didn't have a fancy degree. I had a commerce diploma from Waikato, 3 years of experience at a smaller freight firm in Hamilton, and the kind of obsessive attention to data that most people find annoying at dinner parties. My mom called it a gift. My ex called it exhausting. Either way, it got me the job. I want to paint you a picture of who I was when I walked through those doors, because it matters. I wasn't confident in the way people talk about confidence loud, taking up space, asserting myself in meetings. I was confident in a quieter way. I knew my numbers. I knew when something didn't add up. And I had learned, from watching older women get sidelined at my previous job, that being right wasn't enough. You had to be patient too. The office was open plan, which I hated, but there were good people there. My immediate team was small, 3 of us reporting to the operations manager, a man called Hugh. Hugh was fair, a bit old-fashioned, but genuinely interested in getting things right. He let me work without micromanaging, which was all I needed. The problem started, really, when Hugh went on extended medical leave. He had a knee replacement that went sideways. Complications, the whole thing. He was gone for 4 months. In that gap, a man called Darren stepped in as acting manager. Darren was the kind of person who had been at the company long enough to believe he owned it without ever having built anything. He'd been there 11 years. Knew everyone's name, knew which suppliers played golf on Saturdays, knew which clients liked to be taken to lunch. He was charming in a way that worked on people who didn't look closely. I looked closely. Within 2 weeks of Darren taking over, the atmosphere shifted. He started pulling the 2 other analysts, both men, both younger than me, into conversations I wasn't invited to. Morning catch-ups that happened before I arrived. Decisions about route adjustments that I would have normally been across, made without my input. I'd find out from the system notes, not from any conversation. I didn't make a fuss. I noted it. I kept doing my job. The southern accounts were, genuinely, a disaster. I found 3 route configurations that were bleeding money not through incompetence, exactly, but through inertia. Nobody had revisited the contracts since 2019. Fuel costs had changed. Driver allocation had shifted. The pricing hadn't moved to reflect any of it. I put together a full report, modeled out 4 different restructure options, and sent it to Darren. He forwarded it to the CEO, a man named Clifford, without my name on it. I found out because our EA, a woman who'd been there 15 years, and who I'd become quietly friendly with, mentioned it in passing. She said, "Oh, your report went up well." I said, "Sorry?" And she told me. Clifford had been briefed by Darren on the southern account findings. Darren had presented it as his own work. I sat with that for a few days. I was angry, of course I was, but I also knew that reacting badly would cost me more than it would cost him. I went to Darren directly. I didn't accuse him. I said I'd noticed the report had gone to Clifford and asked if it would be useful for me to be part of any follow-up discussions, given that I had all the underlying data. He smiled and said, "We'll see how it lands first." That was it. Polite, friendly, completely dismissive. Over the next 3 months, I rebuilt every model I had. I documented everything with timestamps. I started CCing myself on everything I sent. Not because I was planning anything, just because I had learned, by then, that documentation was the only thing that mattered when things went wrong. Hugh came back in September. He had a limp and looked tired, but he came back. He pulled me aside in his first week back and asked me directly how things had gone. I told him, honestly, that there had been some communication gaps. I didn't throw Darren under a bus. I just said I'd found it difficult to contribute at the level I was used to, and that I hoped things would settle back down. Hugh nodded slowly. He said, I heard about the Southern report. I looked at him. He said, I know whose work that was, Zara. That meant everything, at the time. It meant someone in that building saw me. Things did settle, for a while. The Southern restructure went ahead, largely based on my models. The margins improved. Clifford gave a presentation at the quarterly review in which he mentioned good analytical work from the operations team. No names, but Hugh looked at me across the room and nodded. I felt, genuinely, that I had built something real. Then Hugh retired. He'd been planning it for a while. It wasn't a surprise, not to him. But for me, it felt like the floor dropping. He was the person who knew what I'd actually done. He was the buffer between me and whatever Darren wanted to be. The role was advertised internally. I applied. I want to be clear about what I was walking into. I had been at the company 2 years by then. I had delivered the most significant operational improvement in the Southern network in 5 years. I know this because I could see it in the numbers, and because 3 separate clients had contacted us to say the reliability of their routes had improved. I had taken on additional project work without being asked. I was, by any reasonable measure, the person for the job. Darren also applied. I knew this would happen. I knew it before Hugh even announced his retirement. I'd watched Darren spend those months building relationships upward, not doing the work, but making himself visible to the people who made decisions. And those people, mostly men in their 50s, found him easy to be around in a way they never quite found me. The interviews were conducted by HR and Clifford. I prepared meticulously. I walked in with a 12-page document outlining the Southern project, the methodology, the outcomes, and my vision for the next phase of operational development. I talked about the team, about collaboration, about where I thought the company needed to go. I walked out feeling like I'd done everything right. 2 weeks later, I was called into a meeting with HR, a woman named Serena and Clifford. I sat down. They told me they'd gone with Darren. I asked why. Clifford said they felt Darren had stronger senior stakeholder experience. Serena nodded along. I asked what that meant, specifically, and whether there was feedback I could use for development. Clifford said something about Darren having been with the company longer and having broader relationships across the business. I said respectfully that longevity and relationships were not the same thing as operational performance, and that I'd be grateful for any concrete metrics by which Darren's application had been stronger than mine. There was a pause. Serena said they appreciated my passion, but that the decision had been made. I said, "Thank you for letting me know." I stood up. I left. I went and sat in my car in the car park for about 20 minutes. I didn't cry. I was too cold for that. I just sat there thinking about how this was the 3rd time in my working life. I had watched a man take credit for a direction I had set, and then been passed over because he'd been doing that long enough that people forgot where the direction came from. I came back inside, and I kept working. For 6 more weeks, I kept doing my job. Darren moved into the manager role. He was polite to me, almost careful, in the way people are when they know they've done something they can't quite defend. Then, on a Tuesday morning in November, I was called back into the meeting room. Serena was there again, and a man from the Auckland office. I didn't know well he was some kind of senior HR partner. They told me that due to a restructure, my role was being disestablished. I said, "What restructure?" They explained that the operations analyst team was being consolidated, 2 roles becoming 1. The other analyst, one of the 2 men, a guy named, I'll just say he'd been there less time than me and had contributed less, was being retained. My role was being disestablished. I said, "On what basis was that decision made?" They told me it was based on business need. I said, "Can you show me the documentation for that decision?" There was a pause. Serena said the process had been followed. I said, "I'd like to see the documentation, please." In writing. They told me they'd get back to me. They offered me a redundancy package, a month's pay, plus a standard reference, and asked me to sign a settlement agreement that included a non-disclosure clause. I said, "I'm not signing anything today." You should have seen their faces. I want to stop here for a moment, because I know a lot of people, when they're handed a piece of paper in that room, sign it, and I understand why. You're in shock. You feel like you don't have any options. You feel like if you make trouble, you'll get nothing. But here's what I wish someone had told me before I ever set foot in that room. You never have to sign anything on the day. In New Zealand, if you're made redundant or dismissed, you have the right to take time to consider any offer. You have the right to get independent legal advice. You have the right to request the documentation behind any decision that affects your employment. These are not aggressive moves. They are your basic rights. I walked out without signing. That afternoon, I called my aunt. She's a family lawyer, not an employment specialist, but she knew someone. By the end of the week, I had a meeting with an employment lawyer based in Wellington who had done this specific kind of case before. She looked at what I had, and then she looked at me, and she said, "How much have you documented?" I slid a folder across the table. She looked through it for a while. Then she said, "This is good. This is really good." Here's what the documentation showed. The report that Darren had forwarded to Clifford under his own name. The timestamps on my files versus when the report was submitted. The CC'd emails showing my analysis had been the source material. The performance review from Hugh, which rated me as exceeding expectations across every metric. The new hire's employment start date, which showed he had been in the company 8 months fewer than me. And this was the thing that my lawyer said was the most significant, the fact that the restructure that disestablished my role had been documented internally only 2 weeks before I was told about it. 2 weeks. No meaningful process. No genuine consideration of alternatives. No genuine selection criteria that held up. She told me this had the hallmarks of a potentially unjustified dismissal, and that I had a strong personal grievance claim. I want to be honest about what the next few months were like, because I don't want this to sound like a tidy story. It wasn't. I had left without another job lined up. I was drawing on savings. I was applying for work and having conversations where I had to explain why I'd left Pinnacle without saying anything that could breach the agreement I hadn't signed. My flatmates were patient, but I could feel the weight of it. My lawyer was methodical. She raised the personal grievance with Pinnacle through the proper channels. They initially pushed back. Their lawyers wrote a long letter about how the restructure was legitimate, how the selection had been fair, how I had been offered a reasonable settlement. My lawyer wrote back with the documentation. Specific, dated, detailed. There was a mediation. I sat across from Serena and the senior HR partner and Darren and a company lawyer in a room in Wellington, and I watched their faces as my lawyer laid out the timeline. The thing about documentation is that it doesn't argue. It just sits there, being true. At mediation, they made an offer. It was better than the first one. My lawyer said it was a start. I said I wanted more. I want to tell you what happened next. And I want to be precise about it, because there's a part of this story that I didn't fully understand until later. Pinnacle's largest client, a South Island food distributor called Southlands Fresh, had a contract up for renewal. The value of that contract was significant. And Southlands Fresh had a managing director, a woman named, I'll call her by her first name only, because she asked me to keep her out of anything public, a woman named Rosalind, who had met me twice in my time at Pinnacle, once at a client visit I'd been part of, and once at an industry event in Christchurch. We'd had a real conversation at that event about the Southern Route restructure, about where the industry was heading. She'd been interested. She'd remembered my name. Rosalind had heard, through channels I still don't fully understand, that I had left Pinnacle. She reached out to me directly, not about anything to do with my dispute, just professionally. She was exploring whether I'd be interested in a consultancy arrangement with Southlands Fresh. She said she'd been impressed with the thinking behind the route improvements and wanted someone who understood the data to help them think about their own distribution model. I told her I was navigating a legal matter and needed to be careful. She said she understood and that there was no rush. 3 days later, Clifford called my lawyer's firm, asking to reopen settlement discussions. I don't know exactly what Clifford knew at that point. I don't know whether Rosalind had said anything to anyone at Pinnacle, or whether someone had simply connected the dots that the person they'd just let go was now talking to the client whose contract was up for renewal. What I do know is that the nature of the conversations changed. Quickly. The final settlement covered my legal fees. It covered a compensation figure that I am not able to disclose, but which was meaningful. It included a clean, factual reference that made no mention of the restructure. And it included a clause for me when I insisted on that the settlement not restrict me from working in the logistics sector. They agreed to all of it. I signed in December, a year almost to the day after I'd first asked to see the documentation they couldn't produce. I started the consultancy work with Southlands Fresh in January. Within 8 months, I had 3 clients. I had registered a business. I was doing the work. I had always been doing the route modeling, the contract analysis, the margin work, but now I was doing it for myself. I heard later through the industry grapevine that Darren had stepped down from the manager role about 14 months after he'd been promoted into it. The specifics weren't clear. I didn't ask. Clifford left the company the following year. I don't know the details there either, and I'm not going to speculate. What I do know is what I learned, and I want to share it clearly because I kept thinking, throughout all of this, about all the women I knew who had been in that room, the settlement room, and had signed without asking a single question. If your role is disestablished in New Zealand, the employer must be able to show that the restructure is genuine. There must be a real business reason. There must be a fair selection process if multiple employees are in the pool. There must be genuine consultation, which means you are told about the possibility before the decision is made, and you are given a real opportunity to respond. 2 weeks of internal documentation, followed by a meeting where you're handed a piece of paper, is not consultation. It may not be lawful. You have the right to raise a personal grievance within 90 days of the action you're grieving. That clock starts ticking, so don't wait too long to get advice. But also, do not sign anything in that room. Take the paperwork home. Read it carefully. Get it in front of someone who knows employment law before you make any decisions. Non-disclosure clauses in settlement agreements are common and often reasonable, but they should not prevent you from getting legal advice, and they should not be so broad that they effectively prevent you from working in your industry. If something in the wording seems off, ask a lawyer and document everything. Not because you're planning to fight anyone, but because documentation is the only thing that makes the truth visible in a room where someone has decided you don't matter. I was 26 when I walked into Pinnacle. I was 28 when I walked out, with my integrity intact and the beginning of something I'd actually built. I stayed quiet for a long time, but quiet was never the same as gone. I've thought about this a lot since everything settled. Not with bitterness, I moved past that faster than I expected, but with genuine curiosity about how it all unfolded the way it did. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you when you're sitting in that room, being handed a piece of paper. The people who cut corners don't usually get away with it forever. Not because of any grand cosmic justice, but because corners cut in the present tend to show up as holes later. Darren didn't steal credit once. He did it consistently, which means he consistently built a reputation on a foundation that wasn't his. That kind of thing holds up until it doesn't. Until the person who actually knows the data is sitting across a table with a lawyer and a folder full of timestamps. I'm not saying I planned any of this. I didn't. I documented because I was careful, not because I was calculating. The difference matters to me. I didn't set a trap. I just refused to pretend the ground beneath me wasn't shifting. What I think about most, looking back, is the moment I said I'm not signing anything today. Because that was the moment I decided my own understanding of events mattered more than their version of it. And that decision, that one quiet, unremarkable sentence, was the hinge everything else turned on. There's something worth naming about intelligence in situations like this. Not the academic kind, not the kind that shows up in performance reviews. The kind that says, slow down, look at what's actually in front of you. Don't let urgency make your decisions. They wanted me to sign quickly because quick signatures close doors. The moment I slowed down, I opened every door I needed. And then there's the question of what you're willing to hold on to when things are hard. The months between leaving Pinnacle and signing the settlement were genuinely difficult. I was careful with money. I was careful with what I said and to whom. I kept my professional relationships clean, even when I was angry. Not because I'm particularly virtuous, but because I understood, by then, that how you conduct yourself in hard times is what your reputation is actually made of. Rosalind reached out to me because she'd met me twice and found me worth remembering. That doesn't happen if you burn things down on the way out. I think about Hugh sometimes too. He was the first person in that building who looked at my work and said, plainly, that he knew it was mine. That mattered. Not because I needed the validation, but because it reminded me that integrity isn't invisible. It accumulates, slowly, in the minds of people who are paying attention. You don't always know who's watching. You don't always know who'll remember. What I know now that I didn't fully understand at 26 is this: doing good work quietly, documenting honestly, and refusing to be rushed in moments of pressure. These are not passive choices. They are a form of discipline that compounds. Darren worked loudly and left nothing real behind him. I worked quietly and built something that outlasted every decision he made about me. That's not a story about revenge. It's a story about what holds,